Okay, so this lecture, I just wanted to go over a handful of different types of eyes out there. I'm not going to go into as much detail as the first human eye we did, but I am going to go over some of the key elements you want to get when you're drawing different types of eyes. So, we're just going to go through each one of these, starting with the drawing, and then in each lecture after this, we'll cover the next step in doing the final piece. So, for this one, this is, I want to show an old person eye and someone who's also blind. So when I'm sketching it out in the drawing phase, I don't draw the pupil in because it's going to be glazed over when we paint it. So there's a lot of wrinkles. There tends to be, let me get a new layer up here that I can paint on top of. There tends to be bags under the eyes, as well as kind of like a hooded lid. The eyelid is dipped under. The sagginess of the brow, and just a fair amount of wrinkles, these crow's feet that come out from the corner of the eye. So all things you want to keep in mind when you're drawing an old person eye. Alright, let's move on to the next one. This one, I just want to illustrate drawing an eye in perspective, and especially one that's sunken into the skull of whatever it is, the creature or the person or whatever, and understanding the form. So you can see here that this is kind of the eye socket, right? And then there's a sphere of the eyeball in here. And then you can see the eyelids wrap around the form of the eye. And we have these wrinkles in here. Okay? This comes from being able to think about the eye as a 3D sphere instead of just a flat plane. Okay? And if you can draw stuff like this in your creatures, it's going to add a lot of depth and a lot of believability to it. A lot of visual interest. Okay? So that's something you want to keep in mind. Let's move on to the next one. So this one is more of a fish type eye. Now, when you're drawing a fish or something similar, maybe like a swamp monster that resembles a fish, some things you want to keep in mind. One, fish don't have eyelids, okay? Which means you're not going to have any of like the corners of the eyes like you would have in a person, and you don't have eyelids that, come on. Usually you can see the entire eye. It's a perfect circle. And you can see the whole thing. Okay? There still tends to be a little bit of wrinkles around it. And they're very fine usually. But there's no eyelids. So keep that in mind. Let's move on to the next one. So this one is either like a feline or a canine, a dog or a cat type animal, like a lion or something. Some things you want to keep in mind about eyes like this. One, the eyelids, the skin around the eyelids is almost always black, okay? On a person, that's not the case. We tend to try and make it the case when we use mascara and eyeliner. However, on a cat and a dog, it's black, naturally. As well as the corner of the eye is very elongated and large, okay? And the eyelid itself is very thick. You can see here, this shape. That's the thickness of the eyelid. And it's pretty big. It takes up a lot of space, so you really want to keep that in mind when you're trying to draw it to capture that form. Okay? Let's move on to the next one. Oh, one more thing as well. The whites of the eye are usually so far back in the head that you can't see them unless they're really looking in an extreme angle, either looking up or down or to the side. And so this whole entire part is the iris. This is all colored. Okay? Except for the pupil. There's not usually like a circle and then the rest of the eye is white. Okay? It's still there. They still have the white of their eye exists. The whole eye isn't colored. It's just their iris is so large that you can't see it. Okay. This is they're called stalks. This part that the eye is on the end of. So stalk eyes. Type of thing you would see on bugs, especially like crabs, lobsters, stuff like that, shrimp. So, things to keep in mind, it's usually actually an oval shape. It's not a sphere, but it's still a 3D object. It's just not a sphere. And then it's on the end of these long stalks that can move around on the end. And the pupil tends to be very small, sometimes even smaller than that, just a little tiny dot. Okay? And then the last one we're going to go over is reptilian. Okay, so reptilian eyes, they vary greatly. There's lots of different kinds. I strongly recommend looking at reference. However, some key elements are that their eyelids close from both the top and bottom, which means they're usually pretty evenly spaced where the eye is open and like a human, it looks more like this, and then a lot of space at the bottom. But with a reptile, it tends to be pretty even on both sides of the eyelid. Another thing is they tend to have these slits for their eyes, and then there's also a secondary protective eye covering, like a second eyelid, that is common with most reptiles, and adding that in really brings another element of realism to it that makes it look really nice. So those are kind of some of the basic drawing tips for drawing eyes like this, and in the next lecture we're going to go over how to flat the colors for each type. Okay, so the next part is going to be to add the flats. So what I have here is a darker background so that the colors show up better, and these are my flats layers. So we'll start with this guy here. As you can see, the pupil, even though this guy is blind, and when we think of creatures or characters with their eyes whited out or blind people, really there is still a very slight change in color where the iris is. Even if you have a cataract and it has completely covered over your iris, there is still a little bit of a color difference between the white of your eye and the iris that's covered over. So I've drawn that here. Plus, when you get older, a lot of times, or if you're sickly, like I wanted this person to feel, your eyelids get a lot more red, and the white of your eye tends to get more yellow. Okay, and that's what I've done here, and it really increases that appearance, as well as making the skin around the eyes feel a little bit greener, and in the corners, bringing in that blue color a little bit deeper to show that the skin is really thin here and really translucent. You can almost see through it. And bringing all of these things together really give this the impression that this person is blind, sick, old. They're just not doing well overall. Okay? Let's move on to the next one. So this one, I wanted this eye to feel really shiny. When it's done, I want it to look almost like a chrome ball. And when I do that and I'm flatting my colors, what I tend to do is just get the flat color of the eye as if there was nothing being reflected off of it, and just paint the whole thing that color with no other variation, because most of it is going to be covered up with the reflection and we'll just be seeing part of what's shining through. So I painted the whole thing red. I wanted to have a red eye. I did a little bit of this pink around the eyelids so that it looked more fleshy, and then I wanted him to feel like a creature, so I did some blues and grays in there. You don't always have to go with red around the eyelids. Some things don't, but most of the time there's a little bit of a red tinge to the area around the eyelid, and the reason being is that the skin around that area is a lot thinner than the skin on other parts of your body, and since it's so thin there, you can see the blood underneath the skin a little bit more clearly, and it makes the skin look more red. Okay, so that's the reason for doing that, but in some cases, maybe if you're drawing a lizard or a snake, that's not really the case. They have scales, and you can't really see the blood underneath their eyes as clearly as you could on, say, a person. So something to keep in mind. Moving on. So for the fish, this one in particular, I want to have a really light eye. Okay, and fish don't usually have a lot of the markings that we see in people's eyes, where we have these, bands, these rays radiating outward from the iris. You don't really see that in fish. It's usually just one straight color all the way through. So there is a little bit of a gradient from the inside of this darker green to the lighter green on the outside. And then I just put the flesh around their eyes is a little bit more red because there is muscle under there that helps them look around a little bit, just a little bit in some fish. And so I put some red near the bottom and then this kind of gray scalish color up top. Okay, moving on. All right, so next we are on to the lion or the dog or cat, whatever it is. You can see, and keep in mind at this point, I'm not painting in any type of highlights or reflections or anything. This is just the flat colors. We'll get to that in a minute. For right now, we're just working with color. So you can see here I've just put in the basic colors of the fur and the skin around the eyes. There tends to be a little bit of reddish brown in the corner of their eyes because they get this goopy stuff that kind of leaks out. If you have a dog or a cat, you can look at it and see that really easily, especially in some breeds. It's really, really prominent. So we have that. And then the iris itself is in the center where the pupil is. There tends to be a darker ring of color that almost from a distance blends in with the iris, or with the pupil, excuse me, and gives it this kind of sunburst look, okay? And then depending on the eye that you're drawing, some eyes have more green in them, some have more red, some have more brown. This one I did a more yellowish orange-brown color. And it's not usually, if you look at it, it's actually not usually very even. It tends to be kind of broken up and splotchy. So once again, that's something that I would recommend using reference for. All right, this guy, the stock type eye. There's so many different types of eyes. If you look at pictures of crabs and lobsters and stuff like that, there's almost an infinite amount. So once again, look at reference. But for this guy, I wanted him to feel like some sort of a bug or something, so I gave him this green chitin hard shell type case, and then a pink fleshy area where his eye moves around at the bottom of the stalk down here. And then his eye, I just did a smooth gradient from yellow to orange to show the color of the eye, okay? And then the last one, this reptile guy. I want his eye to feel really bright, almost like it might be glowing, but you're not quite sure, you know, like he has a fire within him. So that's this guy. Have it really bright orange fading to yellow in the middle. This part, I imagine, is semi-transparent, so you can kind of see the orange underneath. And then the skin of his eye, I imagine this is like a dragon or something, so I wanted there to be scales around the skin area, and then the skin to be a different color. So the skin is kind of like this purplish red, right? And I like the red around the eyes because it makes them look really irritated and angry, you know? And then just the scales, I just did a quick dark red. Okay, so that sums it up for these ones. In the next lecture, we're going to start going over adding some of the shadows and value to the eye and the eyelid area. So I will see you guys in the next one. All right, so we're on to the next part, which is going to be adding our values, our shadows, and our soft highlights. So we're going to start with our shadows on the first eye. If I turn it on, I have this done on a multiply layer, okay? And if I turn it normal really quick, you can see I'm painting with really light colors, okay? And I'm slowly getting darker in the places where I want to get darker. But when I set it to multiply, it's multiplying that color by the layer underneath. Now, in the places where it really gets heavy under the eyebrow and in the crevice of the eyelid, I went really dark. Underneath the bags of the eyes, an important part that a lot of people miss is this shape right here. Oops, let's make sure we're on a new layer up here. This part right here is an important part that a lot of people miss, where there's a shadow being cast by the eyelid. That's important. It's really dark in here, around there, and then in the corners of the eyes it tends to get pretty dark too, as well as in these areas. Okay? So then next was the soft highlights. So making sure you get it along the top of this edge of the eyelid is important. These corners of the eyes tend to catch a little bit of light. At the bottom, at the edge of this crevice, would pick up some light. Okay, and then just some soft shading along these shapes here. All right, so let's move on to the next one. We'll turn that layer back off until we're ready for it. So this one, I really wanted to feel like it was sunken into the head or the face. So all in here is really, really dark. There's a lot of shadow in here, and I went pretty dark with my shading, okay? And then under here, it's not as dark, right? The light's not hitting it, but it's not cast into shadow like this is. There's not any, nearly as much ambient occlusion going on, okay? And ambient occlusion is just when the light can't get as tightly into cracks and crevices, and so it creates a little bit of a line. You can look at, even the wrinkles on your hand. You look at the wrinkles on your hand, the reason they seem a little bit darker is because the ambient occlusion is making it so that as light bounces off everything, the closer it gets to that little crack, the harder it is for light to go all the way in there. And so it just looks a little bit darker. That's ambient occlusion. So there will still be shadows underneath the eyelid, but there won't be nearly as much as there is underneath the eye, right? Because light is having a hard time bouncing up in there, okay? And then I left this part out because I wanted to show some of the reflective highlights later and show that, I'm just imagining that as the light's coming down, the shadow is being cast right here, but that you could still see part of it, okay? So then the highlights, I just put, these are the soft highlights. Once again, we're not doing specular highlights yet or anything else. These are just the soft highlights. So most of these are only going to affect the skin around the eye. So we have this soft light here, and then just bouncing off of these parts of his skin as well. Okay, let's move on to the next part. All right, so this one, what I've done here is the way that the eye is shaped, we've gone over this before, that the iris is shaped like a bowl shape or a cone, right? And because of that, as the light is coming down from this angle, it's casting a shadow all inside of here, okay? And so I've created this gradient that goes from the top to the bottom, and then this part right here has been erased out because this edge of the eye, the lip, is catching light, okay? This part is getting hit by the light that's coming down. Because really, this right here, this is a hole, right? This isn't a flat object. This is a hole into the rest of your eye. Okay, so that would create a lip here that's catching this light, and then the roundness of it has a little bit of a shadow on the bottom, and then I just put some shadows in over here to give it a little bit more form under the wrinkles and stuff. Okay, and then if we turn on our soft highlights, we can see put a little bit more light down here to give it some contrast against the wrinkles of the skin, and then as well as up here on the top of the eye to show that it's a flat plane that's catching some light as well. Okay, so let's move on to the next one. This one, for the shadows, I really push the shadows in the corner of the eye as well as the shadow that's being cast from the eyelid, right? It's a really thick eyelid, and so when the light's coming down, it's going to cast a shadow onto that eyeball. And you can see that where the light is hitting this area, but it's not so much hitting this area, okay? In the corner of the eye and a little bit under here, I didn't go really heavy on this one because I'm imagining it's getting pretty evenly lit. Okay, the next one is this bug type eye. Okay, so for the shadows, you can see that there are cast shadows, which on the other ones, we haven't really come across this yet, just because of the way the lighting has been set up. But what a cast shadow is this part right here. Oops, let's make sure we're on the right brush. This part is a cast shadow, okay? The shadow that's being cast by the eyeball itself, as well as the shadow being cast by the stalk of the eye, okay? We also have this in shadow. The bottom part of the eye is in shadow, and then as well as I put shadow on the bottom of each one of these little knobs, okay? And then up here as well is in shadow. For the highlights, I only did a little bit on top along here, and then also I just barely hit the top of most of these knobs to give them a little bit of a reflection, okay? And then we'll go ahead and move on to the final one, which is the Reptile Eye. Now, for the shadows, I put shadow along the underside of his eyebrow because I'm imagining that that's pretty deep in there and that the light coming down is casting a cast shadow onto the eyeball, similar to over here with the bug eye. Okay, and then some shadow under the eyelid as well as the bottom of the eye. And then some shadow along here to kind of put that back into the distance. And then just a little bit along the edge of the eyebrow as well. Okay. And then as far as highlights go, just a little bit on the eye and a touch along these scales to just show that they have a little bit of form. I didn't get really detailed on the scales because it was going to take a really long time, and I'm mostly focusing on the eye. So that's it for these ones. Okay. The last thing we need to add on these is the specular highlights, okay? And we will do that in the next one. Okay, so this next part is going to be the reflected light that's coming off of these eyes, and each one is going to be a little bit different. So we'll start with the first one over here. And for this one, I just made it really subtle. All of these are on a screen layer. For the most part, I'll explain if they're not. But this one that we're starting out with is on a screen layer, okay? And all it is a little bit of blue and a little bit of green as if it was reflecting some sort of a horizon. And then I put the opacity down to 55% and put it on screen. okay? And that gives it the effect that's just reflecting some of the sky in the foreground in the picture. It's really simple, nothing complicated. That one was pretty basic, okay? Now this one, I wanted it to feel really reflective, almost chrome, okay? Very shiny. So this one is actually just set to normal, and I painted right onto the eye. Zoomed up, you can kind of see all the brush strokes. But if we have it zoomed out, you can really see that it looks very reflective, right? It looks like an eyeball. So the way I did that is I basically imagined what the setting of this scene is that this eyeball is in, and I painted the reflection of that in the eye. Now, some things to keep in mind when you're doing this are that the places near the top, let's make sure on our drawing layer, places on the top and the bottom tend to be a little bit darker in value. And you also want to keep in mind the shape of the eye. Okay, so if this is a sphere, then everything is going to bend along the line of that sphere, okay? And the closer it gets to the edges, the more extreme it's going to get, okay? So you want to keep that in mind when you're painting reflections. And, excuse me, you can lower or raise the opacity as much as you want. I actually have it lowered just a little bit to about right there. And that's how you paint something that's really reflective. And depending on how close up you are to this in your image, maybe the image is actually just a focus on the eye, then you can kind of make this the focal point and get really detailed in that reflection so that the viewers can actually see the world around this creature or whatever it is. Okay? Let's move on to the next one. So this fisheye, like we said before, fisheyes aren't always a perfect sphere. They're actually kind of flat, okay? And so because of that, there's a lot smoother of a gradient, okay? So for this one, I just did a light blue gradient going from the top to the bottom, and it fades off about right here, okay? Right there. And this really gives it the illusion that the sky is lighting this eye, right? We haven't done the bright highlight yet, or the specular highlight. This is just the reflection of the sky in the eye of the fish. And doing that smooth gradient really makes us feel like the surface of this fisheye, instead of being shaped like this from the side, it's actually shaped more like this. Okay? Let's move on to the next one. This guy down here. Once again, this is very similar to the first. Really simple. Just I'll turn it on normal and raise it up higher. Very simple, basic sky foreground color combination. And this one I brought the opacity way down because I wanted it to be really subtle, right? I didn't want it to be taking over the eye kind of like it does on this one or this one. I just wanted it to be there just a little bit to add that sense of realism without becoming the focal point of the eye itself. Okay? So just a touch. And you can still see it makes a difference, but it's not going crazy. And it's going to depend on your painting. Sometimes you want it really prominent, and other times you won't. You're just going to have to make the call. All right, so this one, I imagine this is really shiny and super smooth. So I gave it a pretty hard line on the reflection of the sky, and I imagine that it's reflecting the ground up. And because of the way this is shaped, like we talked about earlier, the more curved something is, that reflection is going to follow the shape of that curve. This one, it really does that, right? It follows all the way up. Okay, and it really catches that reflection in there. And then this last one, I wanted to imagine that the background that it's reflecting is a fiery, sort of dangerous, rocky landscape. So you can see that when I did that, I painted in these cliff shapes, and the sky is orange. Instead of doing a blue reflection like I did with the other ones on a lot of them, this one is red and orange. And by doing that, it sets the tone and the feel and the light for this piece instead of just doing the typical on each one. So what I want you to take away from it is that for each painting, there's no hard set rule, okay? You really have to think about what goes on what scenario, right? What lighting is my subject in, okay? There's not just some hard fast rule, every eye paint a blue reflection with a brown ground, and that will work for everyone. It won't. Right? If you're in a dark, underlit sort of setting, like maybe your character is holding a torch or looking at some magical object in his hand and the rest of the room is dark, then he's going to be getting lit from below, and you're probably going to have to reverse some of these ideas, like flip them upside down. So it just depends on what your lighting is. You really just have to take the time and think about it. Think about it in your head. Try and figure out how would the light be affecting my subject based off of what you've learned from this, okay? These are just some starting points to help you see some different techniques, okay? So in the next lecture, the last thing we're going to be talking about is adding those specular highlights that are really going to take it to the next level. So I will see you guys in that one. All right, so this very last section, we're going over the specular highlights that we have in the eye, okay? So we'll start with the first one as usual, and this I'm doing on a normal layer, okay? I also want you to keep in mind, the techniques I'm using, I'm not using these techniques as I would if I were to paint over the line art. I would probably just lower the opacity a bit and then paint over it similar to how I did in the other eye video. But for these, I just wanted to show you both the drawing and just the basics of how I would light them, so you could get a gist for it. But as you can see, you can still see the line art on all of these. Okay, so these are just kind of quick rough sketches to give you a starting off point. Okay, so for this one, specular highlights, really hitting these corners of the eye that are really shiny. Okay, as well as this edge right here. I want the eye to look really wet. Okay, and so I created this little lip right here, which what that is it's moisture from the eyeball connecting with the surface tension to connect to the eyelid, and that little thick part of liquid right there that's kind of built up would be catching all that light, and so it makes it a little bit more reflective. And then just the two bright highlights right there. Okay, so I'll turn them on and off again so you can see really quick. It makes a huge difference, that little tiny part. It makes it feel so much more real and very wet. Okay, let's move on to the next one. This one, I didn't have a lot to go on here because this part is already reflecting the entire scene, right? There's no one particular spot that's really a bright highlight because the whole thing is already reflecting the scene around it. But there are some highlights in the corner of the eyes, as well as one of the eyelids to feel a little bit more wet, so I put some up here as well as down here. Okay, and I will turn that one on and off again so you can see the differences. Okay, and these specular highlights, you really want to be selective with them. You don't want to go crazy and start putting them everywhere, okay? If we start putting them everywhere, I'll show you what can happen. We'll get this white up here. If you start putting these everywhere, it doesn't look very real, right? If we just put these in every single spot, it begins to look a little bit crazy and unrealistic, right? So you want to be very, very selective with where you put these, okay? And it depends on your painting. If you're painting something that's really, really wet or really smooth and hard, then there's going to be a lot more of these reflective highlights because your subject reflects more light, right? But if it's something like this where it's more of a skin texture and it's not particularly wet everywhere, if I do it too much, it doesn't really feel real. It just feels like I'm painting white on top of everything, and it kind of ruins the illusion, okay? If we do it too much, it's not believable, right? You can't buy into it. So make sure you're really selective with how much you do this. And if you want it to look wet, then I suggest looking at some reference photos. Go look at some pictures of wet skin or maybe amphibians, frogs, salamanders, stuff like that to really get that feel, okay? Let's move on to the next one, the fish one. So in the fish one, I wanted to do a highlight that was a square, okay? So maybe he's inside of a building or something, or there's a window in the room he's in, and so the highlight is a square shape, right? So what you need to keep in mind when you're creating highlights is that this bright spot isn't just a random point of light, right? If it's reflecting from the sun, then it's obviously going to be a circle with kind of a warmish tint to it, right? If there's multiple light sources, right, maybe there's a couple of bright lights shining on it or something like that. Like in this one, for example, there's two, or perhaps there's something blocking out the sun right here in the middle, right? And so it's creating a shadow on the highlight. Then you need to keep that in mind as well, okay? Sometimes you'll need a square, sometimes you'll need a circle. It just depends. Usually if you're in nature or something like that, it's not really going to be a square very often unless there's some reason why it's being shaped like that. Most of the time you're reflecting the sun. So keep in mind what it is that's being reflected in that highlight. Is it the sun? Is it a spotlight? Is it a window? What is it? Okay, is it a flashlight, a candle? Because that's going to depend on how the highlight is shaped, what color it is, things like that, how bright it is. I also popped in just a few highlights on the eyes, on the eyelid, to really bring up the glossiness and the edges of some of these scales to show that they're kind of hard and catching the light. Okay? And then let's move on to the next one. So the lion eye, I put one bright highlight in the center. I'm imagining that the light that's being reflected is the sun. So you can see, as you could tell, I'll compare it to pure white. It has a little bit of a yellowish tinge to it, right? Because the sun is white, right? It's being reflected by the sun. Okay? And then also, along this edge and this edge and this edge is just a little bit of light, okay? Now, if something's really dark or black, like in this case, your highlights aren't going to be bright white or even a light gray. That's going to feel way too bright unless the subject is super shiny and really smooth. So the highlights for this are actually pretty dark. They're almost black. You can see on my color spectrum that it's very, very, very dark, okay? So keep that in mind when you're painting your reflections. Am I really thinking about my value scale and how bright this would actually get even at its brightest point, okay? So keep that in mind as you paint them. And you can also tell what I'm painting with is just a neutral gray, but the gray that I use actually has just a little bit of warmth in it, okay? And you can tell because it has a little bit of a yellow tinge because the light is yellow. So keep that in mind as you're painting. What color is my light? And when you're doing the sun, you don't want something like this bright orange or yellow like this, okay? It should be very subtle, more like this, right? It's almost white, but there's just a little bit of color in it, okay? Move on to the next one. This guy, want him to have one really bright highlight right here, right in the center of his eye, okay? And if you look at a lot of pictures of bugs and stuff like that, they tend to have just a really tiny sharp highlight because their eye is really small, right? The surface on which it's being reflected is really tiny. It's not a very broad plane. And so the point that reflects the light tends to be really small. So all that I did on this one was that tiny little light, okay? And then the last one, we'll turn it on and off so you could see. I put some right here, right? And once again, I'm thinking about the shape, right? It's not just a circle, so clearly that means this is not reflecting the sun, okay? And then a little bit more on the eyelids, the corners of the eyes, and then also this piece right here that is kind of like a secondary eyelid, I wanted to make sure that it felt like its own shape, right? It wasn't just flat, it did have a little bit of a form, and so I put a little bit of a highlight along the edge of that to really capture it, okay? So that's it for these. Once again, these aren't hard, fast rules. I just wanted to give you a variety of different types of eyes and how I would go about painting them in different circumstances. So really try and experiment. Your assignment is to paint 6 different eyes. They can be whatever you want. You can paint eyes from real life and just look at reference, or you can paint them out of your head. If you are painting them out of your head, you should still look at reference if you haven't painted a lot. I would recommend looking at it anyways. You don't necessarily have to paint right from it, but just familiarize yourself with the type of eye you're wanting to paint. Let's look around. So your assignment is to paint 6 of these, and you can paint whatever you want. You can do all human eyes, you could do all animal eyes, but it's up to you. You know what you like painting more. You know what you need to get done. So you pick, but post it in the Facebook group so we can all see. I'd love to see what you guys come up with and how you've improved. So thanks, guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Are you looking for even more content on how to become a digital artist? Then check out some of my online courses. There are over 50 hours of in-depth content, and they cover a range of topics from creature design to light and color, and from character design to digital painting. You'll gain access to a private Facebook group for students only, where you can stay motivated and get feedback on your work. Plus, I provide fully responsive support throughout all of my courses, and I offer a 100% no questions asked money back guarantee. So normally my courses range from $100 to $200, but subscribers can take any of them, anytime, any course for only $12. And once you buy it, you own it for life. There's no time limits, no subscriptions, anything like that. So if you want to show your support and become a better artist in the process, then use the link in the description, or just use promo code YT discount on any of my courses. So appreciate you guys. Have a good one.